Hey, fourth grade friends. We're going to read another chapter in our Spring According to Humphrey book. We are now on chapter 6, and it is called Swim, Swim, Swim. On Monday, Joey's mom threw a small blanket over the aquarium and another one over my cage, and I began my dark journey back to school. Mrs. Brisbane was excited about having the tadpoles, she said, but I'm not sure we need the blankets. It's a beautiful day. Really? I squeaked, because I couldn't see anything. Once my cage was uncovered, I was back on the table by the windowsill in room 26. Boing, boing, Og's strange voice rang out. Be prepared, Og, I squeaked back at him. You're going to see something surprising. Joey's mom set the aquarium on the table between Og's tank and my cage, and then hurried off to work. Soon all my classmates were crowded around the table, asking Joey what was in the aquarium. Mrs. Brisbane told them to take their seats. After the bell rings, we'll talk about our signs of spring. Then Joey will explain what's in the tank. My friends looked disappointed as they went back to their tables. I was pretty sure they'd be even more disappointed when they found out there was nothing in the tank but 2 specks. The bell rang and Mrs. Brisbane took attendance. Now can we see what's in the tank? Slow down, Simon asked. Mrs. Brisbane smiled and said, Try to be a little patient. Now, raise your hand if you'd like to share a sign of spring that you found this weekend. Well, a lot of hands went up, and Mrs. Brisbane called on Rolling Rosie first. It's staying light longer than in the evening, and it was so warm today I didn't have to wear my winter coat. Just a light jacket, she said. Yes, Mrs. Brisbane nodded. The days start to get longer in the spring. Remember, we set our clocks forward an hour for daylight savings time, so the skies are light a lot longer now. Hurry up, Harry raised his hand. But it's darker in the morning. It's hard to get out of bed when it's dark. He yawned a big yawn. Some of my friends laughed, but Mrs. Brisbane agreed. I have to admit, it's hard for me to get up too, Harry. Lots of my classmates had seen leaves budding on trees and grass springing out of the ground and flowers growing. Helpful Holly said her mom had taken her shopping for spring clothes. That's a great sign of spring, Mrs. Brisbane said. The stores are full of Easter candy, Thomas said, but my mom won't buy it for me. She says Easter is a long way off. His comment brought more giggles. Small Paul got up and showed the class a new chart he'd made of spring temperatures over the last 10 years. We've been having average temperatures for spring, he said as he pointed at the wavy lines and explained them. At last it was Joey's turn. My dad sent me 2 signs of spring. May I show them now? He asked Mrs. Brisbane. Our teacher said yes, and Joey walked over to our table. In the spring, lots of animals come out of hibernation and have new babies, he said, including these. All eyes were on Joey as he pulled the small blanket off the aquarium. I heard a gasp, then silence, and the only one who made a sound was Og. Boing, boing, boing. These are tadpoles, Joey said. They're going to grow into tadpoles, and tadpoles grow into frogs. They just look like dots now, but pretty soon they'll grow tails and legs and start to become frogs. Everybody was quiet until Og twanged. Boing, 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 boing. Well, that made everybody laugh. Stop talking, Sophie's hand shut up. Was Og a tadpole once? Joey nodded. Sure, all frogs were. My friends seemed surprised, and so was I. Can we see them? Felipe asked. Mrs. Brisbane had my friends make a line so that each one could have a good look. You might be disappointed, I squeaked. They don't do much. One by one, they came up to the aquarium to look at the specks with Mrs. Brisbane and Joey. What's that goo? Not now, Nicole asked. It's like the inside of an egg, Joey said. He looked up at Mrs. Brisbane. Right? Yes, I think so, she replied, but we will all study tadpoles to learn more about them. Suddenly, Og dived down in the water side of his tank and began splashing loudly. What's wrong with him? Joey asked. Maybe he doesn't want any competition, Mrs. Brisbane said with a smile. Or maybe he's excited to have new friends. What's so exciting about 2 new friends when they're only specks? Having a hamster friend is much more interesting. Well, when Tall Paul came to the tank, he just shook his head. It's hard to believe those 2 dots will become frogs like Og. Boing, boing, Og said. Right, I agreed. Joey explained they wouldn't be exactly like Og because he was a green frog and they were leopard frogs. Wow, Tall Paul said. Will they have spots? Yep, Joey replied. Helpful Holly asked, will they be our classroom pets like Humphrey and Og? No, 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 I squeaked. They're nothing like Og and me. I'm sorry to admit it, but I didn't like that idea at all. They belong to Joey, Mrs. Brisbane said. For now, let's just watch them grow. Well, I watched the specks that night, but I didn't see any changes. Nothing yet, I squeaked to my neighbor. Og stayed strangely silent. And when Aldo came to clean room 26, he was surprised to find a new aquarium on the table between Og's tank and my cage. What is this? He asked, peering at the specks. 2 tadpoles, I squeaked. Of course, I knew that he didn't understand me. Aldo stared, and then he chuckled. Tadpoles, he said. Twin tadpoles. He kept chuckling as he swept the floor. Twins, twins everywhere. I think I'm seeing double. He turned in Og's direction. How do you feel about twin frogs, Og? But Og just sat there like a rock. Og was silent all night long. The specks didn't change one bit. Were they really alive? Although I'm usually active at night, room 26 was so boring, I fell asleep. And I didn't wake up until sunlight was streaming through the door and Mrs. Brisbane opened the door. Morning, she said in a cheery voice. Morning, I squeaked. Og was still silent. I glanced over and saw that Mrs. Brisbane carried a vase with some very colorful flowers in it. They were red and yellow and orange and purple. How are these for signs of spring? She asked as she set the vase on her desk. Very nice, I said. And by the time she took off her coat, Thomas and Felipe raced into the room. Look at this sign of spring. Thomas spread his arms wide and turned in a circle. My mom didn't make me wear my winter jacket. I was getting really tired of that old thing. Besides, the arms were getting really short. I won't be wearing that jacket anymore. Mrs. Brisbane held up the vase of flowers. Here's my sign of spring. Tulips. Wow, look at all the colors, Felipe said. And soon other friends hurried into room 26. Slow Down Simon raced through the door, and instead of heading to the cloakroom to hang up his jacket, he ran straight toward our table. Whoa! I can't believe it, he shouted as he gazed down at the aquarium. This is amazing! Felipe, Thomas, Nicole, and Sophie joined him. Wow, Thomas shouted. You gotta see this! Oh, Sophie said. I just can't believe it, Nicole added. Felipe just laughed. What? I squeaked as I scurried up to the tippy top of my cage to get a better look. Soon Mrs. Brisbane joined them. Oh, she said as she peered into the aquarium. Oh, that's wonderful. And they all stared at the aquarium. I stared too. And instead of 2 specks stuck in some strange gel, I saw 2 specks swimming. Og, can you see it? I squeaked. Og was strangely silent. I hoped he wasn't sick with some kind of frog flu. More of my classmates gathered around the aquarium, and Mrs. Brisbane made sure they all got a good look at the swimming specks. Oh, calm down, Cassie said. Oh, I've never seen anything so, oh, I noticed that her hands were shaking. It is something to see, Cassie, Mrs. Brisbane said. I had to admit, swimming specks were more interesting than specks sitting in goo. But were they really that interesting? Joey thought they were, and while my friends rushed out for recess, he asked Mrs. Brisbane if he could stay inside and sketch. I want to draw the tadpoles at every stage, he said. I want to get my drawings just right. Mrs. Brisbane smiled. Everybody is supposed to go outside at recess. Mrs. Wright wouldn't like it if you stayed inside. Joey looked so disappointed. Maybe, just this once, she won't notice, Mrs. Brisbane said. Go ahead and sketch. Well, Joey worked really hard. He'd look at the swimming specks and then back at his drawing. Good work, Joey, I squeaked. Joey didn't look up, but he said, I want to get it just right, Humphrey. Understand? Of course I understood. I hoped his drawing would help me see what everyone was so excited about. Well, as the day went on, I realized that all my human friends thought the specks were unsqueakably interesting. So interesting that Principal Morales came in to see them after lunch. Amazing, he said. I was getting a little tired of that word. To think that Og started out like this, he said. Everyone looked over at my neighbor, including me. Og just sat there on his rock, silent. And when Mr. Morales left, Mrs. Brisbane led my classmates to the library to learn more about tadpoles. Well, once we were alone in the classroom, I jiggled my lock that doesn't lock and ran over to Og's tank. Og, did you see the specks swimming? I asked. Mrs. Brisbane says they'll be frogs like you. Does that make you happy? Og didn't answer, but he stood up and dived into the water side of his tank with a gigantic splash. Had the specks made him speechless? I returned to my cage and started spinning on my wheel. That's what I do when I need to think. Suddenly, I realized that swimming was what Og did when he needed to think. We both had a lot to think about. Humphrey's spring things. Og's a good friend, loyal and true. But do we need another two? And that is the end of chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed that. We'll move on to chapter 7 very soon. Thanks for joining me. Rudy is asleep in another room, and we will talk to you soon. Have a great day, 4th graders.